The rain had a rhythm. It was the only music my apartment ever played. A steady, percussive tapping against the single large window that overlooked a street of sleeping brick buildings. Most nights, it was a sound that amplified the silence, turning the four white walls of my world into a drum, each drop a reminder of the hollowness inside. I had curated this emptiness, I suppose. My life was a series of quiet, predictable loops. Wake, work at the drafting table that dominated my living space, eat something forgettable, sleep. It was a self-imposed quarantine of the soul, a penance for a past I couldn't fix, and a future I was too afraid to imagine. My one deviation, my single sanctioned indulgence, was the cafe, the Blackbird Diner. It was 3 blocks away, a small pocket of warmth and light in the gray city. Every afternoon, around 3, I would fold up my blueprints, slip on my coat, and walk. The purpose wasn't just the coffee, which was reliably mediocre, but the anonymous companionship of strangers. I could sit in a booth by the window, nurse a single cup for an hour, and watch the world move on without me. It was like watching a film. I was the audience, safe in the dark. For the past year, she had been a part of that film, a woman who seemed too elegant for the worn linoleum floors and cracked vinyl seats. Her name, I'd learned from the small plastic tag on her uniform, was Ilara. She was older than me, maybe late 30s, early 40s. There was a quiet grace in the way she moved, the way she balanced 3 plates on one arm or refilled a coffee cup without spilling a drop. Her smile was a polite, professional thing, a curtain she drew across her face. But her eyes held a different story. They were a soft, weary gray, like a sky that had seen too much weather. I never tried to breach that professional distance. I was just an observer, and she was the most compelling part of the scenery. My order was always the same: black coffee, no sugar. She stopped asking after the first week, just placing it before me with a quiet nod that I would return in kind. It was our entire vocabulary, a silent, 2-step ritual in my world of loops. This routine was my anchor, the one thing that felt solid in the numbing drift of my days. The rain that Tuesday was different. It wasn't the usual gentle percussion. It was a furious, wind-driven assault, blurring the world outside the cafe window into a watercolor wash of brake lights and shimmering asphalt. I sat in my usual booth, the warmth of the ceramic mug a small comfort in my hands. The diner was busier than usual, filled with people seeking refuge from the storm. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and frying bacon, a cacophony of chatter and the clatter of cutlery. Through it all, Alara moved with her usual efficiency, but the grace was gone. Her movements were tight, her shoulders tensed. The polite curtain of her smile had been shredded. I saw it happen near the service station, between the humming coffee percolators and stacks of clean plates. A customer, a man in a loud suit, was complaining, his voice a low grumble. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her face. She nodded, her expression a blank mask, but her throat worked as if she were swallowing something sharp. When he finally turned away, she leaned against the stainless steel counter, her back to the dining room. For a moment, she was perfectly still. Then, her shoulders gave a single, violent shudder. Her hand flew to her mouth and she squeezed her eyes shut. She was fighting a war in that small 2-foot space, a battle to keep the ocean of her grief from breaching the dam of her composure. Something in me cracked. The protective shell of my observer status, the comfortable distance I'd cultivated for so long, it just shattered. I wasn't watching a film anymore. I was in the room, and someone was hurting. The sight of her silent, desperate struggle reached across the noisy diner and touched the most dormant part of my own pain. It was a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in years, a raw, aching empathy that demanded action. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. I had to do something. But what? Offer a platitude? "Are you okay?" The words felt hollow, intrusive. When she finally turned back, her face was pale but composed. The mask was back in place, albeit poorly fitted. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw the glistening track of a tear she'd hastily wiped away. She looked away immediately, busying herself with a stack of menus. My coffee was cold. My hour was up. I pulled a few bills from my wallet, placing them on the table. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen left with the check. I turned the small slip of paper over. The blank space seemed vast. What could I possibly say? Then the words came, not from my head, but from some deeper place, a place that remembered what it was like to drown in silence. I wrote my name, Leo, and my phone number. Beneath it, just 5 words. Talk to me. I folded the bills over the note, slid it to the edge of the table, and walked out into the rain, the bell on the door sounding like a final, irrevocable judgment. The next 3 days were a special kind of hell. The rain stopped, but the storm inside my apartment had just begun. The silence was no longer hollow. It was accusatory. I paced the floorboards, the echo of my own footsteps mocking me. Who did I think I was? Some kind of savior? I'd crossed a line, a sacred boundary between the observer and the observed. She would think I was a creep, some lonely guy trying to take advantage of a moment of weakness. The shame was a physical weight. Each time my phone remained silent, the weight grew heavier. I replayed the moment in the diner endlessly, the tremor in her shoulders, the desperate clench of her jaw. I hadn't been trying to hit on her. It was something else, a recognition. I had seen my own reflection in her pain, the same silent fight to just stay upright when the world was trying to knock you down. I almost didn't go back. On Friday, 3 o'clock came and went. I sat at my drafting table, staring at the clean, precise lines of a municipal building that felt utterly meaningless. The 4 walls of my apartment began to close in. The quiet was suffocating. Finally, unable to bear it, I grabbed my coat. I told myself I just needed coffee. I wouldn't look for her. I would sit in a different booth. But of course, she was there. And of course, my feet carried me to the same booth. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. She approached my table, her face unreadable. She held the coffee pot, but she didn't pour. She just stood there for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the tabletop. I couldn't breathe. "Black, no sugar," she said, her voice a low murmur. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I managed to say, my own voice tight. She poured the coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. As she placed the pot back on her tray, she looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time ever. Her gray eyes were clear, exhausted, and wary. There was no smile. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the same nod as always, but this time it meant something entirely different. It meant, "I saw your note. I'm still here. You're still here. And we are not going to speak of it." A wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washed over me. I hadn't broken anything. I had simply been seen. I nodded back, and the ritual was complete, but forever changed. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of 5 unspoken words. The orbit began. It was a slow, tentative dance of proximity and retreat. I kept my routine, showing up every day at 3. She kept hers, bringing my coffee with that same quiet nod. But things had shifted. The air between us was charged with a delicate awareness. I found myself noticing smaller details. The way she'd tuck a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear, a faint scar above her left eyebrow, the fact that she wore a simple, thin silver band on her right ring finger, but not her left. I would sometimes catch her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. One rainy afternoon, about 2 weeks after the note, she set my coffee down and hesitated. "It's on the house today," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the hiss of the espresso machine. She was already turning away before I could respond. It was a small twist in our established pattern, a tiny offering, a thank you, an acknowledgement. I sat there long after the coffee was gone, the warmth of the gesture lingering far longer than the warmth of the drink. The next week, I walked in to find her arguing softly with the owner, a gruff man named Sal. Her car apparently wouldn't start, and Sal was refusing to let her. Leave a few minutes early to meet the tow truck. She looked defeated. I drank my coffee, paid my bill, insisting on paying this time, earning a small ghost of a smile from her, and left. But instead of going home, I waited in the alley beside the diner, huddled under the awning of the neighboring butcher shop. It felt clandestine and a little foolish, but the thought of her stranded was unbearable. When she finally emerged an hour later, the evening had grown dark and a cold drizzle had started. She walked to an old beat-up sedan, tried the ignition twice, the engine giving a pathetic, gurgling cough, and then slumped over the steering wheel, her head resting on her hands. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows. She startled when I tapped on the window, her eyes wide with alarm that quickly softened into weary recognition when she saw it was me. I didn't say anything, just gestured to my phone. "I can call you a ride," I said through the glass. She rolled down the window, letting in the damp, chilly air. "You don't have to do that." "I know." We stood in that impasse for a moment. Her, in her broken-down car, a small, fragile island. Me, on the wet pavement, an unexpected and possibly unwanted bridge. "My apartment is just a few blocks from here," she said finally, her voice laced with resignation. "Closer than your place, I bet. You could wait for a taxi there. Out of the rain." It was an invitation born of necessity, not desire, but it was an invitation nonetheless. "Okay," I said. The walk was mostly silent. The sterile silence of my own apartment had always been a solitary thing. This silence was different. It was shared, a space between two people who didn't know the rules of engagement. Her apartment was on the second floor of an old brownstone. The moment she unlocked the door and pushed it open, I understood. The sterile, cold silence of my world gave way to the scent of cinnamon and old books, and the low, soulful hum of a jazz saxophone from a pair of small speakers. Her home was a sanctuary. Every surface was covered in things that felt loved. Stacks of worn paperbacks, small potted plants reaching for the light of a single floor lamp, a soft, knitted blanket draped over the arm of an old, comfortable-looking sofa. The walls were a warm, buttery yellow, and they were filled with framed prints of abstract art and black and white photographs of coastlines. It wasn't a space designed to impress. It was a space designed to heal. It was a fortress built of softness and warmth against a world that was clearly hard and cold. "I can make tea," she offered, her voice softer in this space, her own territory. "Tea would be nice," I replied, feeling like a clumsy giant in this delicate world she had built. As she moved around the small kitchen, I stood in the doorway of the living room, taking it all in. This was her. This was the world behind the weary eyes and the polite smile. A world of quiet beauty and deliberate peace. It was the complete antithesis of my own stark existence. My apartment was a waiting room. This place was a home. Looking at the curated calm of her surroundings, I felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar. Not quite envy, but a deep, profound longing. A longing for a sanctuary of my own. She returned with 2 steaming mugs, the ceramic warm against my cold hands. She didn't have to ask how I took it. She'd handed it to me plain. She knew. She sat on the sofa, curling her feet beneath her, and gestured for me to take the armchair opposite. The saxophone on the stereo bled into a mournful piano melody. For the first time, we were just Leo and Alara, 2 people in a warm room, listening to the rain and the quiet music. The entire world held at bay by a simple wooden door. That first night in her apartment became a quiet turning point. The taxi came, and I left. But the memory of that warmth, the scent of cinnamon and the sound of quiet jazz, stayed with me. It was a stark contrast to the sterile echo of my own home. A few days later, on my way to the diner, I saw a flat of vibrant pansies outside a bodega. On an impulse, I bought them. I felt ridiculous carrying the flimsy plastic tray down the street, but I left it on the doorstep of her brownstone with a simple, unsigned note. "For your window box." The next day at the diner, she brought my coffee and a small plate with a slice of lemon pound cake. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, her voice low. "Thank you for the flowers." And so it began. Our connection moved from the public space of the diner to the private sanctuary of her home. It happened in small, careful increments. I'd offer to pick up groceries for her on my way over. She'd insist I stay for dinner as thanks. I learned that she was a wonderful cook, her movements in the kitchen as graceful as they'd been in the diner, but freer, more relaxed. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. I would sit at her small kitchen table, ostensibly reading but mostly just watching her, while she prepared a meal. The conversation at first was light. We talked about books, music, the city. We discovered a shared love for old black and white films and a mutual dislike for cilantro. It was safe territory. But as the weeks bled into a month, the walls began to thin. The talk would drift inevitably into the quiet hours of the evening, over cups of chamomile tea, the city lights just a soft blur through her windows. The first crack in her armor came one night while we were washing dishes. I was washing. She was drying. It was a simple domestic act that felt more intimate than any conversation we'd had. A sad song came on her playlist. A woman singing about a house that was no longer a home. Ilara went still, a dish towel held motionless in her hand. "He loved this singer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't have to say who he was. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and cold. I finished rinsing a plate and placed it in the rack, my movements slow. I didn't press, I just waited. "My husband," she finally clarified, her gaze fixed on the streetlights outside the kitchen window. "My ex-husband. He filled this place with music, for years." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "When he left, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was so loud. It took me a year before I could play a record again." There it was, the first piece of the puzzle, the first real offering of her pain. It was a small fragment, but it felt monumental. I wanted to reach out, to place a hand on her arm, but I didn't. The space was too fragile. Instead, I offered a piece of my own. "My parents' house was always quiet," I said, my voice sounding rough to my own ears. After she was gone, my mom stopped playing the piano. It was like the whole house was holding its breath. Still is, I think." She turned from the window and looked at me, her gray eyes searching my face. She saw the truth of it there, a shared landscape of loss and suffocating silence. She didn't ask what happened to my sister. She didn't have to. She just nodded, a deep, understanding sorrow in her expression. In that moment, we weren't a waitress and her customer, or even new friends. We were two survivors, mapping out the common borders of our private griefs. The bond deepened. I learned that her ex-husband, a man named Marcus, had been a musician. He had left her not for another woman, but for the promise of a life on the road, a life that had no room for her quiet stability. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had dismantled her belief in partnership, in shared futures. He'd made her feel that her love was a cage. "He said he needed to be free," she told me one night, her voice thin, as if I were the warden. I found myself wanting to protect her, not just from the world, but from the ghosts that haunted her beautiful, quiet rooms. I started leaving my drafting table earlier and earlier, the pull of her sanctuary stronger than my need for solitary work. I helped her repaint a wall in the living room that had been bothering her. We spent a whole Saturday, splattered in pale green paint, laughing at our clumsiness. The sound of her real, unguarded laughter was like the first sun after a long winter. It was a revelation. It made me feel inexplicably hopeful. One evening, we were on the sofa watching an old film. It was late. The credits were rolling, and the mournful score filled the quiet room. She was curled at the other end of the sofa, a blanket tucked around her. She looked small and terribly vulnerable. A wave of affection, so strong it was almost painful, washed over me. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that her home had become my home, that the sight of her reading by the lamplight was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, that her quiet strength made me feel stronger. But I said nothing. Instead, guided by an impulse I couldn't contain, I reached across the space between us and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek. My fingers grazed her skin. It was the first time I had touched her with deliberate, non-accidental tenderness. She flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it felt like a gunshot in the silent room. She pulled back, her whole body tensing. Her eyes, which had been soft and sleepy, were now wide with something that looked like fear. The warmth between us instantly evaporated, replaced by a sudden, freezing chill. "Ilara?" I whispered, pulling my hand back as if I'd been burned. She shook her head, not looking at me. She hugged her knees to her chest, making herself smaller. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice strained. I can't." "Can't what?" The question was gentle, but my heart was pounding. "This," she whispered, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. "You and me. I don't know what this is, Leo, but I can't do it." The dam I had seen her hold back in the diner that first day was cracking again, right here on her sofa. Her voice trembled. "Every time I start to feel comfortable, I remember how it felt when he left. The floor just disappeared from under my feet. I can't go through that again. I won't." She was retreating, pulling all the beautiful, warm pieces of herself back inside her fortress and slamming the gate shut. The fear in her eyes was a raw, gaping wound. Fear of me. Fear of what I represented, another potential loss, another person who could walk away and leave her in a silence even louder than the last. "I'm not him," I said, the words feeling useless. "You don't know that," she shot back, her voice sharper now, edged with panic. "No one ever thinks they will be. I need some space, Leo, please." The please broke me. It wasn't a demand. It was a desperate plea. I had pushed too far, too fast. I had trespassed. My attempt at comfort had become a threat. Without another word, I stood up. The path to the door felt a mile long. I could feel her watching me, her fear and my hurt creating a toxic, unbreathable atmosphere in the room that had been my only refuge. I let myself out, the click of the latch echoing behind me. I walked home through the cold, empty streets, and for the first time in months, the silence of my own apartment felt like a familiar, deserved punishment. The sanctuary was lost. The week that followed was a return to the old silence, but it was 1,000 times worse. Before, it had been a numb, static state of being. Now, it was an active, aching void where her presence used to be. The quiet of my apartment was no longer just quiet. It was the sound of her absence. I didn't go to the diner. I couldn't. The thought of seeing her behind that counter, the polite, professional mask back in place, was more than I could bear. I tried to work, but the lines on my blueprints blurred. Every straight edge, every perfect angle seemed to mock the messy, broken geometry of my life. Loneliness wasn't just a state anymore. It was a predator. It stalked the corners of my rooms. I thought about the first note I'd left. "Talk to me." It felt like a lifetime ago. I had invited her to share her pain, and in doing so, I had become a part of it, another source of it. I had wanted to be a safe harbor, and instead, I had become the storm. After 7 days of this self-inflicted exile, I couldn't take it anymore. A decision formed, solid and clear in the fog of my misery. I had to see her. Not to demand anything, not to persuade her, but to finish the conversation we had started. To give her the piece of myself I had held back. It was the only honest thing I had left to offer. It was raining again, a soft, steady drizzle this time, weeping from a sky the color of slate. It felt appropriate. I walked the familiar blocks to her brownstone, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to close the loop. I stood on her doorstep for a long time, the cool mist settling on my coat, before I finally raised my hand and knocked. It took her a long time to answer. When the door opened a few inches, she was silhouetted by the warm light of her living room. She was wearing a thick sweater, and her hair was down. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed. She didn't look surprised to see me, just infinitely sad. "Leo," she breathed. Can I just say one thing?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "I won't come in. I'll say it right here, and then I'll go." She hesitated, her hand tight on the doorknob. Then she nodded, a barely perceptible motion. I took a deep breath, the damp air filling my lungs. "You said you were afraid I'd leave, like he did. That you can't go through that again. I understand that, but I need you to understand why I wouldn't. Why I couldn't." I looked past her, into the sanctuary she had built, and the words I had kept locked away for a decade began to spill out. When I was 17, I had a younger sister, Chloe. She was 14. She was everything, bright and funny, and she painted these terrible, wonderful, vibrant paintings. One Saturday, my parents went out, and I was supposed to be watching her. We had an argument. Something stupid. I don't even remember what. She ran upstairs to her room. I was angry, so I just let her go. I put on my headphones, blasted music, and shut her out. My voice broke. I had to stop, swallowing against the knot in my throat. Alara's face, framed in the doorway, was still, her expression softening from wariness into something else, something closer. An hour later, I continued, my voice a raw whisper. I went up to apologize. The house was so quiet. Her door was locked. I broke it down. She was gone. She'd struggled with a sadness we didn't understand. None of us. There was a note. It said she was sorry. I looked down at my hands, seeing them as they were then, useless and shaking. I was in the house the whole time. In the house. And the silence. I didn't notice the silence until it was too late. I failed her. I was supposed to be her protector, and I put on headphones. I finally looked up and met her gaze. Tears were openly streaming down her face now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I don't tell you that for your pity," I said, my own eyes burning. "I tell you because when I saw you in the diner that day trying so hard not to cry, all I could see was that silence, the kind that swallows people whole. And I couldn't just sit there and listen to it again. Leaving you, Alara? Walking away when someone is in pain? That's not something I'm capable of doing. It's the one thing in this world I know I could never do again." I had laid my deepest, most broken part at her feet. There was nothing left to hide. A profound emptiness and a strange sense of peace settled over me. "That's all," I said quietly. "I just wanted you to know." I turned to leave. I had made it 2 steps down the stoop when her voice, small but clear, cut through the sound of the rain. "Leo, wait." I stopped, my back to her. I heard the door open wider, heard her footsteps on the wet stone behind me. She didn't say another word. She just stepped in front of me, looked up into my face, and rose on her toes. Her hands came up to cup my jaw, her palms warm against my cold, rain-damp skin. And she kissed me. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound, heartbreaking acceptance. It was gentle and wet with her tears in the rain, and it tasted of salt and sorrow and a fragile, terrifying hope. It was the end of the silence. The aftermath of the confession was quiet, not awkward. It felt like the calm after a fever breaks. She led me inside, and we sat on her sofa, the same sofa where our connection had fractured, and this time, there was no space between us. She held my hand, her fingers laced through mine, a silent anchor. We didn't talk for a long time. There was nothing that needed to be said. We had shown each other our deepest wounds, and the act of witness had become a balm. The days that followed were a process of gentle navigation. We were a we now, a concept so new and fragile it felt like holding a newborn bird. There was a shyness to our interactions, a careful tenderness. A morning text message from me. "Thinking of you." A picture sent from her in the afternoon. The pansies I'd bought her, thriving in their window box. We were learning a new language, one built on reassurance and presence. I started spending my evenings at her apartment by default. I'd finish my work, pack a small bag, and walk the few blocks to her brownstone. The journey no longer felt like an escape from my loneliness, but a return to my center. We would cook together, the small kitchen, a comfortable dance of shared tasks. We'd watch our old films. But now she would lean her head against my shoulder, her warmth a constant, steady comfort. The ghosts in her home seemed to quiet down, replaced by the gentle, living sounds of us. The fear hadn't vanished entirely. I would sometimes see a flicker of it in her eyes if I moved too suddenly, or if a conversation veered toward the distant future. But it was no longer in control. It was a shadow in a room now filled with light. Trust wasn't a decision. We were learning it was a practice, a daily choice to believe in the safety we were building together. My own apartment grew more and more foreign. I'd go back every couple of days to get clothes or check the mail, and the sterile silence would hit me like a physical blow. The white walls seemed colder, the emptiness more profound. It was a museum of a life I no longer lived. My drafting table, once the epicenter of my world, was now just a piece of furniture collecting a thin layer of dust. My life was happening elsewhere. It was happening in a warm, buttery yellow room, to the sound of quiet jazz and her soft breathing beside me in the dark. About 2 months after that rainy night on her stoop, we were having a quiet Sunday morning. The light streamed through the living room windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I was sitting in the armchair reading, and she was on the sofa, sketching in a notepad. The air was filled with the scent of coffee and a deep, settled peace. She looked up from her sketchbook, her expression thoughtful. "It's silly," she said, her voice soft. "What's silly?" I asked, lowering my book. "You, going back there." She gestured vaguely in the direction of my apartment. "Packing a bag every other day like you're just visiting. You're not just visiting, are you?" My heart gave a slow, steady thump. "No," I said. "I'm not." She put her sketchbook down on the cushion beside her. On the small wooden table between us, next to our 2 coffee mugs, she placed a single, small, brass key. It was old and worn, the teeth smoothed with use. It lay there on the dark wood, gleaming in the morning sun. "It's the bottom lock," she said quietly, her gray eyes holding mine. "It's sticky. You have to jiggle it a little." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a simple, practical statement that held the weight of a lifetime of promises. It was the key to the sanctuary. It was the ultimate symbol of trust, an offering that said, "This home is your home. You belong here. I am not afraid of you staying." I looked from the key to her face, at the gentle hope that had replaced the fear in her eyes, and I felt a sense of rightness so profound it almost brought me to my knees. The long season of my penance was over. I reached out and my fingers closed around the warm metal. It felt heavy and real in my palm. I didn't need to say, "Thank you," or "I love you," or anything else. She knew. I simply stood up, walked over to the sofa, and knelt in front of her, taking her sketching hand in mine and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. We were building a future, not on grand gestures, but on small, sturdy acts of faith. Months have passed. It is autumn now, and the leaves on the trees outside our window are turning brilliant shades of rust and gold. It's evening, and a soft rain is tapping against the glass. It's the same sound that once underscored my loneliness, the rhythm of my isolation. Tonight, it is just weather. A gentle, percussive score for the quiet life we have built within these walls. I'm at the kitchen table, sketching in a notebook of my own, an old habit rediscovered. Alara is on the sofa, curled under the familiar knitted blanket, a book resting in her lap, her eyes closed. She's not asleep, just listening to the rain and the low hum of the piano music filling the room. The lamplight catches the silver in her dark hair and pools on the warm wood of the floor. Her face in repose is peaceful. The deep, weary lines of sorrow that first drew me to her have softened, smoothed by months of quiet joy and shared peace. I look around the room. My coat is hanging by the door. My books are mixed in with hers on the shelves. My favorite coffee mug, a chipped blue one, is drying by the sink. This is not her sanctuary anymore. It is ours. The fortress built to keep the world out has become the home we share to let each other in. She opens her eyes and her gaze finds mine across the room. She gives me a small, soft smile. It's not the polite, professional curtain from the diner, nor is it the brilliant, rare flash of unguarded laughter. This is something new, a smile of deep, settled contentment, a smile that says, "Look at what we built." I smile back, a feeling of profound gratitude swelling in my chest. We have not erased our pasts. The ghosts of Chloe and Marcus will always be a part of our stories, the quiet sorrows that shaped us. But they are no longer the loudest voices in the room. We have healed, not by forgetting, but by holding the broken pieces of each other until they fused into something new, something stronger. I think of the man I was, a year ago, sitting alone in a sterile room, watching the world through a window. I think of the note, the 5 small words scrawled on the back of a receipt. Talk to me. It wasn't a solution. It was an invitation, an opening of a door. And through it, we both walked, out of the rain and into the quiet, steady warmth of home. The music plays on, the rain falls, and for the first time in a very long time, I feel a complete and utter sense of peace. It is the quiet, contented exhale at the end of a long, long journey.